What follows is free. But if you want to see the full extent of what we do and get involved, go to patreon.com/word in your ear. Now, on with the show.
Well, welcome to another edition of Word in Your Ear. The Sgt. Pepper remix box set came out very memorably in 2017, and then we had the White Album, and we had Abbey Road, and we had Let It Be, all of them completely enthralling. And then there was a troubling suspicion for all us completists and obsessives that was it, that was our lot. But the news is good. In fact, it's delightful because the remixed Revolver is about to be upon us, and the main man at the controls, as ever, is the great Giles Martin. Giles, it's so nice to see you. How are you?
I'm very well. It's lovely to see you, Mark. We've known each other for a long time.
We have. I met you, I think, when you were 13 at a wedding. Yeah, there we are. You told me great stories about the Beatles. It's very nice to see you. So where are you at the moment?
I'm in New York. I'm in the studios in New York. I'm actually talking about Revolver. We're sort of launching it. And I've been doing playbacks for people, trying to explain what the process is and you know the differences are. They build me a great big Atmos immersive room where 30 people have been, and I've been playing Revolver in an immersive way to people.
Fantastic. Well, look, the first question I should ask, I think, is where does Revolver sit, the album, in your kind of hierarchy of Beatles albums? I mean, a lot of people think of it as the great masterpiece. I mean, what are your feelings about it?
Well, I think it is a masterpiece. I really think it is. I think it's
Absolutely.
I think it's you know, it's very hard for me to judge because, you know, in all honesty, I don't go home and listen to Beatles albums, you know, because I end up getting a chance to mix them and get to work on them, and it's sort of, you know, it's a bit like Stockholm syndrome. You sort of get chained to a radiator of an album and learn to love it, and then you're released from it. And it's the same with all the Beatles albums I've done. I think Revolver's, you know, what's been odd was the fact that I spent a long time, we'll talk about this later, long time working on Get Back with Peter Jackson and the Let It Be period, because it almost felt like we were sort of living in 1969 for a long period of time.
Yeah.
During that period, we started looking at Revolver, and I went back to some of the outtakes, and it was like listening to a different band. And so it's hard to compare. I mean, I would say that Revolver is a band unwrapping the presents they've just found up under their tree, and Let It Be is the presents are scattered around and they're ignoring them. You know, concepts and ideas, but I mean, everyone is valid. I don't have a favorite, but it's you just have to appreciate them all in a way.
But it's interesting re-listening to it this morning. It struck me that it's obviously it's a collaborative record. We'll get onto that later. But it's also the first record which is them really as individuals. It's like the precursor of the White Album, actually. That their individual styles are so obvious. The first three tracks are Taxman, Eleanor Rigby, and I'm Only Sleeping, which are so different, aren't they?
Yeah, I have a great privileged position where I get to go to Abbey Road and they give me the tapes and I get to play around with these albums, and then I sit down with Paul and play on the mixes, and the first thing he said to me, "You're so right," was, "This is our most individual record. This is the where we found ourselves." And you know, they went on holiday for the first time in their lives. They went on holiday, and it could indulge themselves. They're meant to be doing a film. The film got cancelled. They went on holiday, and they'd reject you against become this sort of four-headed monster with a Beatles suit on, which was Beatlemania, and they were writing songs, you know, amazing songs like "She Loves You" and "Can't Buy Me Love" and "I Want to Hold Your Hand," and that whole sort of pop mentality went out the window. And they also turned their back on Mersey Beat. The rhythm structures on Revolver are very different from their previous albums, and it's like, you know, it's like punk and prog mentality to Revolver, where they just went, okay, you know, I think the world are going, which one's the cute one, which one's the smart one, which one's the funny one, etc., etc. And they realized that they were a band made up of four individuals, and those four individuals had very different approaches that all worked together. It was almost like, you know, they couldn't. And what's interesting is that their next album, they went and put the suits on and became a Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. This is a glimpse of what was to happen, you know, Revolver.
But the styles are extraordinary. There's kind of Indian raga music, there's chamber music, there's
there's
the strings, the Motown.
It's like working on 7 different bands, you know, or 8 different bands mixing. Yeah. And I think if any other band apart from the Beatles had done this, they'd have been accused of being pretentious. And any band now would just be odd.
That's true. And I'm still struck by just how far ahead of its time it was. I was listening to the Tomorrow Never Knows, and in the charts that week that they were recording that was, I think it was Herman's Hermits and the Seekers. So, I mean, obviously there was slightly more adventurous stuff, but that's the kind that was the general state of play while they were in Abbey Road making that record. It does seem absolutely astonishing, doesn't it? Because if that came out tomorrow, it'd still sound contemporary.
Yeah, that's the thing about Revolver. It's got a lot of groundbreaking oddities on it. And what also strikes me is just the open-mindedness they all had, including my dad, actually, in his approach. This is George Martin, in his approach of just going, John. He said John played a song without changing chord and just held the chord of C and sang "Tomorrow Never Knows" and said, I wanted to sound like I'm singing from a Himalayan mountaintop. And then for everyone to go, yeah, that's a good idea. Let's do that. And to go from that, as you say to Eleanor Rigby, which is like Bernard Herrmann's Psycho strings. That was the inspiration for it. They heard Bernard Herrmann doing strings from Psycho. And to do that. That sort of, there was, yeah. Paul says, it's the two things. We became individuals and we discovered pop. That was Revolver. And it was just that expansion of ideas and the acceptance of everyone's ideas. That's the key. It's not like no one had a bad idea, and it's a bit like creative is a bit like surfing. Most of us paddle in water and get hit by waves, and very few people get to like ride the wave. And the Beatles rode the wave the whole time during the making of Revolver.
Yeah, that's absolutely astonishing. I was going to ask about your dad's contribution. What do you think his main contribution to that record was?
I think well, he obviously his musicality, but his open-mindedness and willing to push the boundaries with Jeff Emerick, who'd just come on board, who was I think a 19, 20-year-old engineer. You can tell the Beatles, they wanted to be the biggest pop band in the world. People think that bands, become successful by accident, but there's a huge amount of ambition involved. And they wanted to become the most successful band in the world, and they did that. They wanted to become the biggest touring band in the world, and they did that. And I think they wanted to become the best recorded band in the world. And I think they pushed my dad and Jeff Emerick within themselves. They all had tape machines, hence the tape loops from Tomorrow Never Knows. They were recording themselves, and I think that they were pushing things like bass sounds and innovations. And my dad always said, the Beatles never wanted to make Jaws 2. They never wanted to do the same. And Revolver's the ultimate of that. No track sounds the same.
Not
and
remotely.
If you check the drums, I mean, the drums on, I was mixing Dr. Robert, and I was thinking, is the snare drum really meant to sound like that? It's this very dead snare drum compared to, say, She Said or Taxman. It's like they deliberately morphed, constantly. And I think my dad's contribution was to allow them to do that. But I always see him like a satellite dish, that he sort of absorbed everything like a huge, all these ideas, and managed to distill them onto a single vinyl record and managed to capture them in an efficient way. And he was always very organized in his thought process, and the Beatles were as well. And that's why the song's really 2.5 minutes long. There's no chat.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's
and also it struck me that the template that they developed, the idea that you didn't have to have singles on the record, was such an advantage, because actually, there was a single. There was Yellow Submarine was a single, but they weren't looking to make singles. So there wasn't that pressure on them all the time to say, is this the big commercial track? It was just allowed to be the track it was intended to be. Do you think that's true?
Well, I think they were under pressure to have singles, but they weren't part of their albums.
But not necessarily on the albums. Yeah, those singles were made independently, but they were paid back right or whatever.
Exactly. And people don't realize just the sheer scale. I mean, the unusual things about the Beatles isn't the fact they did 250 songs in 7.5 years or whatever it was. The fact that most of them were good.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that's true. I think that you know what, and I know this from working with Paul. I'm actually producing Paul. That his enthusiasm for being in the studio, I've never met anyone like it. I've never it's like he's been given this opportunity, even now, to go and make something, and he never takes it for granted. And I think you get that sense on Revolver. You don't get, in the outtakes and in the feel of the record, it's endless sort of visceral enthusiasm, throwing yourselves in, throwing yourselves out of a plane without a parachute, knowing that you're going to land safely. No matter what you're doing, whether you're doing, Indian or trance music or classical or Motown, like, got to get you into my life, or or sensitive. It's constant kind of like, we're going to do this, and we're going to, and it's the belief in themselves. I said to my dad, who's, as you know, I was very, very close to, and he was unwell, he was dying, he was on his deathbed, and I said, Dad, do you ever think you weren't very good at music? I was doing music for a Kingsman film at the time. I said, I've got this scene, I can't work out how to do it. And he goes, I think, oh, great, son. I said, but I do feel as though I'm a bit rubbish at times. I said, and he closes his eyes. He goes, no, I always thought I was brilliant. And he didn't mean that as I also was brilliant, so I'm brilliant. He just went, that's what they had. They really the Beatles
completely.
They really believed that, and they were brilliant.
And everything was worth trying, and it might work out. If it didn't work out, they could abandon it. They'd work a way around it. Yeah. Oh no, it's just astonishing. There's two aspects to the big box set, the reissue. One is the remixing side, and the other is the outtakes and the demos, and we'll talk about those in a moment. But first, I just want to ask you a really basic question about remixing, for the benefit of anybody listening who doesn't fully understand what that process is. Can you describe what's involved in making a remix?
Yeah, okay, I can. So a lot of people call it remastering, which it isn't, and
it's not though. That's a different thing.
Yeah. The best analogy I can give, which actually wasn't mine, it was given to me by almost, I think it was a journalist said to me, he goes, the best analogy I can give is like, if you have a car and you want to make it look nice, you might polish it. You might you polish out the car, maybe do some body work. That's it. That's remastering. If you're remixing, you take the car completely to pieces again and you rebuild it and then you polish it. That's what remixing is. That's the difference in the process. So I'm taking the raw multi-track tapes, the guitar, bass, drums, vocals, and I'm rebalancing them and putting them back together again.
Basically clarifying, like you're clarifying and giving it more impact. And
correct, yeah. I'm working from the raw materials upwards. I'm rebuilding the album from not from scratch, from its recorded elements. That's the best way.
But beyond Revolver, from Sgt. Pepper onwards, they were using, I think, more tracks to record, and so it would be easier to separate those individual sounds. But I mean, Revolver was that 4-track? Some of that.
Revolver's 4-track. Sgt. Pepper was 4-track, but they used a technique of bouncing where.
Yeah.
A good example I can give you is. Little Help from My Friends on Sgt. Pepper was recorded guitar, bass, drums, and piano on 4 different elements of a 4-track, and then that's full. That tape is full.
Yeah.
But they took that and they took those 4 elements and they bounced it to a second 4-track. So on that 4-track, on track 1 they had guitar, bass, and drums and piano, and then they could put vocals or whatever on the next 3 tracks. So that's but Revolver, they didn't do that. They just had the 4-track. So an example would be Taxman. If you listen to the original stereo Taxman, it's guitar, bass, and drums on one track.
They're on one track, aren't they? That's right.
Track. And then there's two Georges, 2 sets of vocals and backing vocals that were recorded together. And there's a lead guitar and a shaker and a cowbell. Okay, so that's
the first thing you've got to do is to try and separate all those elements as much as you can. So how did you? Because I think I'd read something about Peter Jackson's.
Yeah. So this is the key story behind Revolver.
Yeah.
So Revolver would and I never planned on mixing any Beatles records, and Sgt. Pepper came along, and I sort of said no to the Beatles. My dad had just passed away, and I'm not sure if it's the right thing to do. And then we talked about it. I said, well, I'll do a couple of tracks and see what it sounds like. And we did it, and they liked it. And so and then the album came out, and I nervously boarded up my house, waited for the bricks to come through the windows, and people liked it. That's what happened. And now we're at Revolver, but I can't do Revolver because it's hard for listeners to imagine, but if I have guitar, bass, and drums, I can put those left or right. I can't separate those things. They're all joined together. And so I'd end up with the same mix. And then working on Get Back, the pandemic hit, and Get Back went from a 2-hour movie to a 7.5-hour movie. We spent a long time working on audio and audio restoration. They're all Nagra tapes, which are these little 1/4-inch brown reels of tape, which were used for audio for the film. We're trying to get the song sounding good. We're trying to get the speech clear. And he had a guy called Emile Delaray in New Zealand that was the dialogue editor, which means he looks after the voice, all the voices. And Peter was obsessive about making sure that you could hear the Beatles talk. But of course, they're playing their instruments and there's other people moving. And so Emile devised a method of removing the guitar from a voice or cleaning things up, restoring stuff. And he did that by going to he went to the people in America who were working on, it was Police, so not the band, but the actual institution.
Yeah.
Were using dialogue cleaned for like mafia cases or people, recording in rooms, all that sort of stuff. And there was a guy who had an AI system and machine learning, and he developed the system. We got to a stage where it became remarkable. And at the end of Get Back, I just said to Emil, I said, listen, I've got this Revolver album. Do you want to have a go at doing it? And I sent him Taxman, good example. And he literally sent me guitar, bass, and drums separately. And they sound like, you can even hear the squeak of Ringo's foot pedal on his kick drum.
Fantastic.
Even though he's taking guitar. And it's completely, it's very, very, it's alchemy. I have no idea. I have no idea. And we sort of honed it and we worked together on it, and it ended up being a situation where I could have more than just the 4 tracks to work with. And that's why we could do the stereo mix of Revolver. A long story, but it opened the door. And the analogy if I give to anyone listening, it's like you give me a cake and say, okay, here's the flour, milk, eggs, sugar.
Yeah.
Here's the elements of that cake, and they're all in their bowls having you give me a cake. It's that clever.
So did you give them all of the tracks, and they sent them back to you with as much separation as they could?
Yeah, manage? I did. I mean, there was tracks like Eleanor Rigby I didn't need to, because Eleanor Rigby was recorded on a 4-track with the string octet on a 4-track, and that was actually bounced. That was bounced stereo. So that was needed to do. We did everything. We did everything, and it meant that, if you listen to I'm Only Sleeping, you can suddenly hear Ringo's drums actually a little bit clearer.
Yeah.
Because he's separate.
So if you're starting a track like I'm Only Sleeping, then how many actual tracks then are you starting with when you start the remix? I mean, how many of them are there?
Well, so what I would ask him to do is, I think, and I'm going to have to do some memory. I think I'm has bass, acoustic guitar, and drums together.
Yeah.
You could separate those, and then there's the backwards guitar, which is on its own, and 2 sets of vocals. So I could have the bass, acoustic guitar, and drums separated, and then I would get them to separate the kick drum, which is the floor drum, and the snare drum, so they're on their own as well. And so I'd end up with sort of 9 tracks out of 4, I suppose. And
which of those tracks do you think is the most transformed by that process? I mean, are there any that just sound particularly more, I don't know, punchy or clearer or have more impact?
I think there's tracks like She Said. I'm Only Sleeping does, interesting enough, because obviously there's a lot of ADT, which is artificial double tracking. It's a very, by design, it's a very sort of murky track, and I try and respect that. It's like, I was very lucky. One of the first projects I did was the Love Project, and I mixed in the Walrus in Studio 3 and just thought I was a genius, sounded amazing. And then I listened to the original, and the original sounded really bad, but sounded much better than mine, because it was claustrophobic and distorted and all those sort of things. And you learn that making things sound good doesn't actually make things sound good, if that makes any sense.
No, I know what you mean.
You need the dirt there. I think certain tracks, like I'm Only Sleeping, for the softer songs actually come out really well, because you can hear Ringo's kick drum, and the finger snaps on Here, There, and Everywhere, which I'd never really noticed before. Then you go back and listen to the original record, and they're there. Yeah, and it's good for things like She Said, because the drums aren't over to one side so much with the rest of the band. They can be more central, and so therefore it's more rocking. You have Ringo coming out of both speakers as opposed to one speaker, and you've got also to remember, with Revolver, stereo wasn't a thing. Stereo didn't. Most people listened. Radio was in mono. Most people's systems at home were mono. Yeah, it was, and so there was no need to think about this. And the way I like to, I don't want anyone to listen to technology when they listen to a song for a start. But I do like the idea that I'm kind of doing, and I knew my dad pretty well, I'm kind of doing, and Paul's around, obviously Paul listens to everything, and so does Ringo, that this is what they would have done if they had this. That's what I'm trying to channel. Yeah. I'm not trying to smear my ego all over it, ego all over the record.
But as regards the outtakes, I think there's 28 early takes, I think there's 3 home demos or whatever. I mean, when you start a project like this, do you presumably have to work out if there are a sufficient number of outtakes to be able to constitute a box set? Because that's one of the main, elements of what makes it commercial, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's not really much of a commercial thought or bone in my body, actually, when it comes to these things. But But you know, the question was, okay, do we have enough outtakes? Because the way they're recorded so quickly. I mean, to give an example, there is an outtake of just the rhythm track of Paperback Writer on these outtakes.
Yeah.
And it's actually the recording of Paperback Writer, the guitars and the drums. And they played it 1.5 times. You know, they played Paperback Writer, it broke down halfway through, they played it again, and then it was finished. That's the outtake of Paperback Writer. So we put it on there because it's just interesting. It's like that's how they were as a band.
Yeah.
But it was, you know, just digging through, you know, again.
But all that somebody must have dug through around the time of Anthology, which is whatever it was, 1995. And presumably every one of those tracks had been gone through looking for possible outtakes.
Yeah, I guess I wasn't really around because I was still at college.
Yeah, yeah.
I sort of helped my dad about an Anthology too. I remember being in the room for that.
Yeah.
But I don't. Yeah, I because there's things we found which are like there's a songwriting demo of Yellow Submarine on this box set, a Revolver.
It's astonishing.
Which is John singing Yellow Submarine, and I always thought it was a Paul song. I didn't realize it was John's. It was originally a John idea, and he's singing like a bit like Woody Guthrie, and 3/4 he's singing, you know, in the town where I was born, no one cared.
No one cared.
And then obviously you hear Paul getting involved, and Paul sort of developing it to more of a pop song and making it 4/4 and the acceptance that John has with that, and you hear their collaboration. It's just so I think we've unearthed.
I thought that was absolutely astonishing because I think everybody just imagined we're going to write the Ringo song now. And there's one outtake where you can hear outtake 41, I think it is, where you can hear the song changing, can't you? You can hear Paul coming in and suggesting that, and he changed it from waltz to 4/time, and suddenly it becomes a completely different thing. I mean, that's absolutely riveting, I think.
And I think the difference is between the Anthology and this is that the Anthology was trying to tell the story of the Beatles, and with this, I you know, each one of these albums is unique and special in its own right, and a historical document. Even though that's never our approach. Our approach is like, you know, my kids will say to me, "There's a great new band I heard, Dad. It's called Fleetwood Mac," you know, and they don't see music as getting old. They just, you know, it's just not happening now. The music, you know, and I think the Beatles should line up with that. And the Beatles are 25 years old when they're doing Revolver. They'll be 25 years old doing Revolver forever. So they're younger than Harry Styles, for instance.
Yes.
So I look at it like that. But there is a historical thing in this, like a bit like wandering through a gallery, where the outtakes are like pencil sketches of the paintings. And that's our approach. Like, we're trying to go, this is how it developed. This is there's a beauty in the humanity of the process of just going, what's the secret behind the Beatles sound? It's like, it's the Beatles. It's the fact that the four of them made such a great noise together. You know, there's not a button that was pressed. You know, that's the secret.
And you listen to those outtakes and you could hear the collaborative process. It was still a very collaborative thing, wasn't it? I mean, there's a beginning of Got to Get You Into My Life where they're all talking about at what point they should all come in, and your dad's involved. You can hear John, you can hear Paul. And did you feel it was still very, very collaborative at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it was collaborative at every point.
Pretty much all the way through. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you know, whatever happened in the studio was a very different journey. When they were making music, I don't think they ever lost. And it's more so, and I know when I speak to Paul and Ringo and we listen to the albums and stuff, their admiration they have for the other players, just as a musician, admiration they have for the other players is unquestionable. You know, it's like, well, you know, I mean, you know, Paul goes, it's interesting you hear what George is doing here, or, you know, that there is that, you know, there's no drummer like Ringo, and you know, and that's so John, or it's really, they know now it was the best band they've ever been in, just as enjoying being in a band. And I never, from all of the work I've done on this is the 5th album I've mixed, I guess, I never get a sense they're not enjoying themselves in their recording.
There's a version of For No One where, and you can tell how sure Paul is about the arrangement of it, and it's just on his piano part. And it really struck me, and I'm sure it struck everybody watching the Get Back movie, that Paul tended to arrive. Tended to be not just a songwriter, but someone who wrote records. Like in his head, he could imagine every instrument. He could imagine the way it was going to be produced. He could imagine the way it sounded. And John was, I suppose, more a songwriter and was unsure of how it was going to develop. Would that be true? That that from the very beginning, Paul tended to have an overall idea of what the sound of it would be like.
I mean, yeah, Paul's a very good producer. I mean, listen to. I actually mixed for him. I mixed in Atmos. I mixed McCartney 1, 2, and 3 for him this year.
Yeah.
They stand up those records as really well produced and clever records. They're not, they're very different, the 3 records. And he likes to have a collaborator, though. I think he liked to with my dad in the 80s because he was a good collaborator, and he misses him now. I think John was I never worked with John, but obviously my dad was talking about, John was more of a person that it was never, he had an idea about how he wanted to sound, but he couldn't explain it.
Yeah.
And, for instance, he would instinctively want certain things, like, demand, like, he ended up, his vocal ended up going through a Leslie speaker for the second half of Tomorrow and Have Knows, because he wanted to sound like he's from a mountaintop. My dad famously sort of said, I think with On the Walrus, John said, I wanted to sound orange, but that pushed creatively, that there's some sort of understanding that they had with John, which meant that John, some of his songs became the most interesting, whether it's Paul or my dad understanding it. And
he was surrounded by people who understood what you meant if you said,
yeah, exactly. So
it's like Bob Dylan talking about the wild Mercury sound of,
you take things like, you take unusual sort of, unusual sounds like Strawberry Fields, or even Come Together.
Yeah.
Is an interesting sounding record. There's lots of, which is, as soon as Come Together starts, it's that song.
Absolutely.
There's, John wrote these songs which sort of demanded a different approach, I guess.
Yeah. To just describe the fantastic speech band that appears on the run through of Eleanor Rigby when your father is talking to the strings players and talking to Paul and offering him 2 options, because that's so interesting, the detail of which he's observed it.
Yeah, I love that, actually. So this is take 2 of Eleanor Rigby.
Yeah.
And they'd obviously played it once. Well, there's a recording of them playing once, and they discuss, both Paul and my dad had realized that Bernard Herrmann, who wrote Psycho, that was going to be the template for Eleanor, which is very sharp, strident strings. And he discussed with the string players whether they should play with vibrato and non-vibrato, which basically do they wiggle their fingers around when they're bowing. And what's amazing about this speech thing is how the string players. So I always thought, I always got the impression that string players may have been a bit sort of aloof to the sessions. They were very involved in having opinions about what would be right for Eleanor Rigby, having only played it once, by the way. And Paul is up in the booth. What's interesting is Paul's up in the booth, and you hear his voice on talkback through a speaker in the room. And that's because no one's wearing headphones. The string players and my dad aren't wearing headphones because there's no reason to.
Right.
They're not playing to a click track.
Yeah.
They're playing to, it's purely human feel. It's purely my dad counting them in. And I think for me, it's lovely because you hear, it's when you hear the collaboration and if you think, 10 minutes before this conversation, Eleanor Rigby would never have been heard. It was just dots on a page. And it's that beauty of creating these masterpieces out of thin air, and not harming anyone while you're doing it.
Absolutely.
It's just sound waves in a room.
No, there's one other absolutely extraordinary thing is hearing Rain. And Rain has that very kind of lazy psychedelic kind of fuzz to it. And then you discover that the reason that it sounds like that is because they recorded it much, much faster, didn't they? And you've got the original version of it. It's astonishing they could even technically play it at that speed, but then that was slowed down, wasn't it?
Yeah, Ringo, they wanted Rain to have this heavy feel to it. So, and that's the thing. It's just the idea that go back to unwrapping presents is that we have all of these ideas and we're going to try every single one of them on every single song.
Yeah.
And we're not scared of anything. So yeah, Rain was recorded at a much faster tempo, which is actually very difficult for the drummer because the drummer has to play incredibly accurately. And you hear the original tempo, it sounds like it's been sped up, and then you hear then you understand why there's a sound to Rain, which is that kind of has that swagger to it and that depth to
Mm.
it. Everything's slowed down.
It's very rare that you hear early sketches, as you were calling them, of songs, and think you actually or wish they'd left something in, because you tend to be so used to the finished result. But there's a bit when they're on "I'm Only Sleeping" with the xylophone part,
Yeah,
and that would have really suited that song. It's
it would.
extraordinary, isn't it? It
It
was
would. Yeah,
abandoned. It really just
yeah.
sounds absolutely beautiful. Just a really unusual sound. But and what was McCartney's reaction to the finished thing then? I mean, what did he say when he heard it all, the remix?
Yeah, he loved it. He loved it. I mean, he's incredibly kind. I mean, I've known him all my life, and he's always been unbelievably supportive. And I mean, he's actually the reason why I think I ended up doing the Love Show, in a way.
Yeah,
Uh, and yeah, he said to me, it's funny, we'll sit and we chat about stuff, and I give him a button. He has a button on the desk which goes between old mix and new mix, old mix, new mix, and they're running time together, so you can flick between the two in case I've screwed up the old record in any way. And there's a couple of things like the guitars and Ennio Burke sing, I didn't have loud enough. They're really loud in the original. He goes, well, they should be really loud in this one. Don't be scared of not, that, let's take people's head off. That's the whole point with the Beatles.
yeah,
So, and at the same time, his attitude is like, you have to do stuff. If you can find these technological advances, if you can make things happen like this. And Ringo says the same thing. I mean, with the Beatles, we've got your back to a certain extent. They go, if we say it's okay, it's okay. So you just go and do it. That's their attitude. But we don't pay to do nothing. It's like that's the kind of mentality. And we'll rein you back in if you go too far.
Well, I mean, it works wonderfully, and I suppose the obvious thing is, will you carry on going back through the back catalogue, back to the beginning? I mean, it's hard to know whether or not a remix version of the very early albums would work as well, or if there are as many outtakes. I don't really know. But is that the plan?
In all honesty, I don't know either. I don't know. I mean, it's sort of, I was kind of throw myself into these projects, and I go off and do other things. I'm doing an Amy Winehouse biopic with Sam Taylor Johnson, and I'm
Fantastic.
Another film, and I go off and do other things, then come back and do, I mix other people. I come back and do another, like throw myself into other people, and it'll probably be Rubber Soul, I would have thought, but that has difficult technical challenges. Each song has different, I remember, got to get you into my life was the biggest challenge for some reason. I remember trying to mix that, and myself and Sam O'Kello I work with, we struggled with that for a while. So yeah, I think I always am waiting for the fans more than anything else to go, please stop, enough's enough.
I don't imagine that's going to happen.
and what happens is people are genuinely enthusiastic about this. And actually this particular one, Revolver, for some reason, just playing it to people has really captured, whether it's a younger record or whatever it is, it's really captured people's imagination. Suddenly people realize, actually, wait a second, I hate the idea of music getting old. I think we just get old around music.
Yeah.
I think that's what happens.
No, well, that's really well put. And I think the whole thing consists of 63 tracks on 5 CDs and 4 vinyl albums. I think there's even a 7-inch EP of Paperback Writer and Rain, and there's a 100-page hardbound book and essays by McCartney. And I think it's all out on October the 28th or whatever it is. And it's fantastic. It's so good. Congratulations. And Thank you, Mark. Brilliant to talk to you. Thanks, Giles, very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you.
Great.